Susan Morse, Senior Editor with Healthcare Finance. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar, Insider Threat Detection and Prevention, What You Need to Know Now, sponsored by SailPoint. Healthcare provider organizations are fighting back against those who attempt to access sensitive data for questionable motives. As a one-stop shop, provider organizations possess protected health information, personally identifiable information, and even payment card industry data, all of which are sought after on the cyber crime black market. In some cases where medical research is conducted, the provider organization must further concern itself with governing access to research data. While most providers are leveraging various technology to keep outsiders out of their IT infrastructure, the information security gap continues to widen because data exposure is often due to someone from within the organization. Our speakers today are Janet King, Senior Director of Market Insights with HIMSS Media, and Paul Truelove, Chief Product Officer with SailPoint. With that, I'll hand it over to Janet to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Susan. So good morning, everybody. The research we're going to be discussing today was conducted online among cybersecurity decision makers and influencers in April of this year. Our goal was to determine how healthcare providers perceive and manage insider threats to cybersecurity. Qualified respondents were employed in a mix of IT, business, and clinical roles at U.S. hospitals and health systems of varying sizes. And we had a total of 101 qualified respondents participate in the survey. One interesting thing to note from the research is that involvement with cybersecurity decisions and initiatives is not really the sole responsibility of just the IT and security teams. In fact, we found that those in business and clinical roles within hospitals and health systems also play an important role in shaping those cybersecurity priorities and influencing purchase decisions. And the existence of a cybersecurity buyer collective, if you will, is relevant when it comes to managing insider threats to cybersecurity because those threats can be initiated by a variety of users. They can come from employees and staff. They're also volunteers, vendor partners, contractors, and even patients who are accessing their personal health records via online portals. Any one of those users can expose sensitive data, putting the organization's security at risk. So having a multifaceted perspective on cybersecurity across a variety of roles and functions, I think can only help to elevate that conversation.
That's true, Janet. Insiders, fundamentally encompass a much broader set of stakeholders than many organizations sometimes consider. And unfortunately, their behavior can expose sensitive data for one of several reasons. Sometimes accidentally, the reality, I think, of a lot of data, that does leak within the enterprise is, based on somebody not realizing the reality of what they're doing, and so it's an accident. It could be negligence, somebody that knowingly disregards established policies and chooses maybe to send information to somebody that shouldn't have it, but they're not malicious in their intent with it. And then, unfortunately, there are the malicious ones, which we tend to focus on the most, where users are intentionally exposing sensitive data for various reasons. And we have to look at all of these cases because at the end of the day, our job in the healthcare space is to protect patient data from any of these types of examples. And while organizations may be tempted to focus on the malicious events, we still have that responsibility both from a security and compliance perspective to control access. And this is especially true in our current regulatory environment.
That's a great point, Paul, and I think it's a fact that is seemingly not lost on these cybersecurity decision makers. So we saw in the research that roughly 9 out of 10 respondents note that they're highly concerned about insider threats, which indicates an acute level of concern around this kind of cybersecurity threats to healthcare organizations. So, Paul, do you think that level of concern is justified?
Yes, I think it is. Given that provider organizations must now govern access for all digital identities, and their access to all applications and files where patient data or sensitive organizational data resides. And so this creates millions of unique access points to manage. And so in light of this, the level of awareness indicated by the data seems nominal. And in fact, as patient expectations and technology advances continue to drive, a far more connected healthcare experience, I think this will continue to grow, and hopefully we'll see, even a greater shift, towards the level of concern, because that means people will be ready to react to that.
Right. I would agree with that. And I think it's also noticeable that business and clinical leaders who may not be as close as IT professionals to the actual process of governing access, but are the ones who are on the front line of leveraging data and information to deliver care and to move the organization forward, they're more likely to be highly concerned about insider threats to cybersecurity than IT. It's about a 10-point differential for that highest level of concern between the two groups. And Paul, I'm curious to know what you think about that.
I think, like you said, it demonstrates an important acknowledgement by the business and clinical teams, that not only should they prevent the breaches to begin with, but if a breach does occur, the remediation process will likely have a negative impact on operational workflows, and for clinicians particularly could impact their ability to deliver care. So I'm honestly more concerned about the lower rating by the IT respondents, and it could indicate that there is a disconnect within some healthcare providers, between the clinical and business operation teams who work with patients and their data day to day versus the technical teams that manage the underlying systems and infrastructure that ultimately will need to be reconciled.
A valid point, and maybe a little bit of a wake-up call for healthcare organizations to really strive to improve the collaboration or the information sharing that's happening among those key stakeholders on this really important issue. And I think you mentioned earlier that it's, much of the media attention today focuses on external breaches and would-be hackers. So we all see the news stories about those, on an all too frequent basis across a variety of verticals. But what we see reflected in the research is that the majority of healthcare providers, about 3/4, really do view insiders as an equal or greater threat to unwanted exposure of sensitive data. And in fact, among those who actually have boots on the ground, those who are actually responsible for implementing or managing those cybersecurity solutions, 43% feel insider threats are actually of greater concern than external breaches, and that's about a 10 percentage point increase over respondents overall. So again, those who are actually actively implementing and managing cybersecurity solutions are even a little more concerned, have a more elevated level of concern about insider threats to data security compared to those more publicized external breaches. But I'm curious, Paul, whether you think that as a rule in the healthcare industry, if we're paying enough attention to insider threats as part of the overall cybersecurity risk mix.
Yeah, interesting question. I think much of the discussion that we continue to see in conjunction with security events, especially within healthcare organizations, is probably still too focused on keeping outsiders, on the outside of IT infrastructure and data. And so, it fundamentally doesn't matter whether the actor in the process is an internal or external, person, if the systems and the data contained within those systems is unfortunately being accessed and potentially used inappropriately. At the end of the day, that constitutes a breach, and we have to be thinking of it in that way. So, I think one of the realities that we see is some of the more exceptional breaches, meaning the ones that have been maybe larger scale and had a more negative impact on the organization, have unfortunately been traced directly back to insiders. And even that hasn't fundamentally raised the visibility to the degree that we might expect. In a recent survey conducted by SailPoint outside of this particular exercise, we found that only 3 out of 5 organizations, and this was more broadly across verticals than just healthcare, but only 3 out of 5 organizations acknowledged that they expected to be breached. And so in this case, I'm not concerned about the 60% that said the likelihood of being breached is there and they're managing to that. It's really the other 40%. I wonder what they're thinking. It's far better off in today's current situation to assume that you're going to be breached and have systems in place so that you can address that total threat environment, because it's often going to be coming not only from outside where we have focused a lot of our attention, but unfortunately from inside the organization. And insider threats are a complex topic. The looming issues that are seldom addressed, include what happens if the threat originates from an insider. What do you do once someone with malintent gets inside the network and is using valid credentials, whether that person, was already inside the network, or whether maybe the threat did originate from outside, but they have now gained legitimate access that an employee might have already been granted, but they're using that account, to extract information for their own personal gain. And at the end of the day, how would you mitigate, non-malicious insider risks? For example, those accidental or negligent exposure of sensitive patient data, that still creates the burden, to address it as a breach and manage, that insider threat.
Yep, those are important questions to be sure. So let's take a look at some of the steps that healthcare organizations are taking to actually thwart insider threats to security. And we do see training, which you just mentioned, continues to be a staple for really addressing threats posed by insiders. And about 3/4 of the cybersecurity decision makers that we spoke to in hospitals and health systems are relying on that tactic today. In addition, a little more than half report that they're leveraging data loss prevention, identity governance, and access behavior monitoring and analytics to try to minimize the risk from insider threats. So, Paul, do you think healthcare organizations are doing enough to really close those critical security and compliance gaps?
Not necessarily, and the widespread reliance on training in DLP indicates, not an interest in dealing with the insider threats, but, fundamentally raises the question on where other things like identity governance, fit into the strategies. And so it's great to see, the overall level of activity around, implementation of security solutions that can help address insider threats. But I'm not sure that in all cases, the decision makers, both within the business and IT organizations, fundamentally recognize the importance of identity governance in the total solution that they need to bring forward. The research shows that only about half of healthcare organizations are currently leveraging identity governance for data stored in files or applications, and that's a good example of where I think we've got some conversations to have. But in our minds, identity governance creates a foundation, and really helps establish broader security and compliance initiatives, by drawing back everything to the connection between the identities and the access that those identities possess. And so the value of identity governance really starts before a file is captured, by DLP in a security event. It mitigates the risk of inappropriate access by identifying the users who should have access, or in some cases, the users that do have access but should not have access to specific systems and data. And so when applied together, the combination of a strong identity governance foundation with things like data loss prevention or access behavior and monitoring tools, really do provide a complementary approach to prevention and intervention capabilities.
Thanks, Paul. I think that's a really good point, and one that is made increasingly relevant as the number of applications that these hospitals and health systems rely on continues to grow. So we all know that managing that complex, diverse application portfolio is challenging, and those without a unified identity governance approach are potentially leaving their organizations open to some security gaps. But what we found was that about 2/3 of those that we've surveyed have incorporated less than half of their applications into a unified identity governance approach. So as organizations start to think about identity governance and potentially moving more of their application portfolio into a unified approach, what are some of the benefits they can expect to gain, Paul?
The challenge is the disparate processes that often exist around identity governance become an Achilles heel for healthcare providers, or really any type of enterprise. So governing digital identities and their access to systems and data, through a consistent and unified approach really addresses this. And it not only allows organizations to reduce delays in granting access for new users, or as a user moves through their life cycle and changes roles, make sure that access continues to be aligned, but it also avoids improper or inconsistent provisioning and deprovisioning of access, and ultimately reduces workload on IT administrators and the data stewards within the organization. And so you get a big benefit from an operational perspective, but I think as importantly that unified identity governance approach also then translates into much stronger security and compliance capabilities and better operational workflows for users with that cost efficiency tied in. So there's a number of benefits that come by taking a very consistent and unified approach for all of your applications and file storage systems within a healthcare provider organization.
Thanks. That brings us to the next point we want to discuss today. So if you think about the collaboration and sharing of information that's really needed by modern healthcare organizations to deliver excellent patient care, it can create some blind spots where sensitive data isn't well protected. And one of the most significant examples of this occurs during the data life cycle. So as patient data and other sensitive information are extracted from applications and databases, it's often manipulated and saved in file formats. So it might be in a PDF or a PowerPoint deck or a text document or a spreadsheet. And those files may be further edited, resulting in multiple versions being stored across a variety of locations, and sometimes those locations may not be secure. And the research reveals that healthcare providers are relying on approaches like directory group membership and permissions assignments, which are frankly somewhat inefficient, they're difficult to manage, and they're not easily scaled. So Paul, did that surprise you at all?
Unfortunately, it doesn't. I think many healthcare providers are deficient in securing their data and are not deploying, a holistic identity management program that includes all of these files. And part of the reason is confusion over who owns the problem of governing access to files and file storage systems. I talk to organizations all of the time who don't include the identity team in the actual process, of overseeing this type of access, and it creates a significant blind spot and a gap in controls. And so we continue to evangelize an approach that really is designed to link all users, all applications, and all data together in that single governance model, so that we can have very transparent visibility to who has access to what, and then apply very consistent business processes and controls no matter where the data resides. And applications tend to be the focus of a lot of identity programs, but very quickly we're finding that as data moves, you have to follow the data. And so files and file storage systems are gaining a lot more attention as we go forward. Because this is the only way that an organization can truly protect their sensitive data, no matter where it resides. And that's interesting because most providers recognize the importance of monitoring and analyzing user access behavior, but being able to do that requires tools with sophisticated capabilities and fundamentally requires a deeper understanding of identity than just directory and group memberships and the like. So as healthcare, as the healthcare space continues to evolve and becomes increasingly complex, with more users, more applications, more data, the aid of identity analytics-based, artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies will likely become a critical part in gathering and synthesizing data, especially access-related data, so that we have a deep contextual insight and we can actually drive recommendations, on where the enterprise and its users should focus their business processes and controls around identity management. We really see the ability to link what users have access to, how that access is being used, and both how those things compare to like users in the organization as a key to understanding risk in an increasingly complex and more digital world.
Thanks, Paul. That is all a really great perspective. I really appreciate you adding some of that context to today's discussion. So what did we really learn from the research? What is the truth about insider threats to cybersecurity in healthcare? And there are kind of 5 key themes that came out of the research, just to recap them here. The first is that insider threats are widely viewed as a key cybersecurity concern, and that's a fact that's recognized really by IT, business, and clinical leaders in healthcare organizations today. Second, we see that while much of the media attention focuses on external breaches, these cybersecurity influencers that we spoke to acknowledge that insider threats are of equal or greater concern to their cybersecurity challenges. And while training is a top tactic for thwarting some of those insider threats, data loss prevention and identity governance is beginning to gain traction and be more widely utilized. However, too many are still leaving their organizations exposed by not deploying technology that really enables secure governance. The fourth point is that a unified governance approach can really help there, and healthcare organizations can expect to gain some fairly significant security and compliance benefits as they move more of their application workload into a unified identity governance approach. And then finally, healthcare providers can do more to protect sensitive data stored in files. It's a big challenge, but deploying a holistic identity program that includes these files is a good place to start. So Susan, back to you. Do we have questions from the audience?
Hi, Janet. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you to Paul as well. Yes, we have a number of questions from the audience. The first one is, do you consider employees who are more likely to grant access to outsiders by clicking on the hyperlinks in phishing attacks to be an insider threat due to being unfamiliar with technology and or are they uneducated on the risk of these attacks?
So I think a phishing attack, by definition, is generally external unless it was originated by somebody inside of the organization that was trying to take advantage of things that they knew. But it does, I think, demonstrate an important linkage between external threats like a phishing attack and the implications that it has on internal access, because it shows that people are trying to get access to valid insider credentials so that they can use those to gain, whether it's access to systems or data for malicious intent. So it does link, but I still, would fundamentally classify that as an external, external threat.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Our next question says, I was at HIMSS this year, and I agree there weren't many presentations focusing on insider threats. Why do you suppose that is?
I think from a historical perspective, we've wanted to trust the people inside of our networks that we've essentially granted access to. Whether those are our employees or our contractors, there are business partners. But more and more, I think what we're finding is that, unfortunately, that trust comes with a heavy price if access that you've, granted to someone is being used to intentionally hurt the organization. I think, in addition, it goes back to my other statement in the previous question response, which was, sometimes it's not the person that you've granted access to that's using the access rights inappropriately. It is you have been, the fact is you have been compromised, and that access is now being used by someone that was never they were never the intentional recipient of the access, and they're using it in a malicious or negligent way. And so we just have to keep a much, I think, stronger focus on the totality of the threat environment and not let ourselves be drawn back, into maybe a more historical view of where the risks really, fundamentally lie.
Okay, thank you. Our next question asks, are you able to see a difference in responses between management and staff, particularly in the levels of concerns around insider threats?
Thanks, Susan. Most of the respondents to this research actually held management level and higher titles. So I didn't really see a significant level of difference between the staff who responded to the survey and those in more managerial level roles. However, like we pointed out earlier, there were some differences between IT and business and clinical decision makers, particularly when it came just to the overall level of concern about insider threats to cybersecurity. They both had high levels of concern about cybersecurity and about insider threats in particular, but it was slightly more elevated among those business and clinical decision makers.
Okay. Thanks, Janet. Another question wants more elaboration about the slide referencing how you would secure data stored in files. The question asks, there was a reference to a unified identity management solution. Can you elaborate on that? And are you talking about a single sign-on?
So in this particular case, I wasn't referring directly to single sign-on. I think what we're really talking about is the more foundational identity governance framework that you would use to define the model on who should have access, then very transparently gain insight into who actually does have access and bring those things into alignment. And so when we look at data stored in files, one of the things that we tend to see is organizations not including the file storage systems themselves in their approach to governing access to sensitive data. And so what happens then is, you may be already using something like single sign-on, for the authorization activity, but you're not really viewing the access that an individual has to those files, as part of your larger identity governance program. And so that creates blind spots. And it might be that your organization is doing a great job of regular access reviews and certifications for your databases and maybe your electronic healthcare record system, like an Epic or a Cerner. But then, as people extract data from that and they put it in Excel or they put it in PowerPoint or they put it in a Word document and store it on a Windows file server or maybe out in something like Box or Dropbox, you're not able to see that information exists out there, and you're not reviewing the access that people have to it. And so it can create an easy place for bad things to potentially happen.
Okay, thank you, Paul. The next question is it's about insiders getting information out there. It says, if an insider has authority to access certain applications but was using that access to intentionally leak information, how would you even know to stop that person inside of the organization?
Yeah, so that's where we come back to a little bit of a layered approach. One of the things that we're finding, I think, a real value from as we look forward is the ability to associate behavioral aspects to a lot of the identity governance processes. And so in this particular case, what we would want to be able to do is pull in usage information. And that could come from a security information and event management system or a SIEM solution, could come from log files. And we want to create a behavioral pattern model around that so that we know what normal access behavior looks like for an individual user, for a peer set of users that have a common job responsibility. And then when we see something that is out of norm, we can very quickly respond to it. And that response may take two forms. It may take the form of alerting a security administrator that the number of hits on a particular application or file repository has exceeded a defined threshold that is reasonable. And so we want to go look at that and make a decision whether, there's a justifiable business reason that that's occurring, or know that it's not, and we need to go do additional remediation activities, or we might even leverage that information to automatically lock the user's account or deprovision their access temporarily so that we can make sure that no additional leakage occurs while we're following up on the reasons behind that. So, I think as we look to the future of what we want to see, that behavioral information is going to become, very important in our ability to ultimately manage risk in the context of the identity governance process and program.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And before we continue, I just want to remind everyone that you can submit a question using the Ask a Question panel on your screen. Our next question asks, do you define data stored in files as unstructured data?
Yes, I think that is a very easy way to define the type of information that is generally contained in a file. You know, and there's lots of different types of unstructured data, and it's one of the reasons that we're finding, you know, it can be a blind spot, and it can be a place where organizations are maybe more exposed than they want to be. You know, as data moves from a structured system, you know, like an EHR or, you know, other application, into a wide variety of kind of files. And one of the use cases that we see quite often is somebody that, you know, that extracts a report into Excel, does an analysis in Excel, and then maybe rolls up the summary information, you know, into a PowerPoint, but attaches the Excel file. And so now you've really created multiple points of exposure that you have to manage because the data is just as sensitive as it was when it originated, you know, in that application framework.
Our next questioner asks, I think part of the problem with insider threats is that many hospitals do not have adequate logging of internal activities and focus too much on perimeter security. I think this is along the lines maybe of a previous question. How would you recommend elevating this conversation with the C-suite to authorize the spend to